Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here on this interesting Tuesday in our country's history. Welcome to the January installment of PPP's Pro People Lawyering series. For those who I don't know, my name is Molly Coleman, and I'm the Executive Director of People's Parity Project. I'm filling in today for our National Organizing Director, Steve Kennedy, who usually runs these. So please bear with me as I navigate this. As we confront a very changed world, a world that has changed a lot in precisely the last 24 hours, I cannot tell you all how excited I am to be here with Terri Gerstein today. As you will hear over the next 50 odd minutes, Terri is somebody who has really never relied on the federal government to be the champion of the rights of workers. Instead, she has been at the forefront of pushing state and local governments to use every tool in their toolbox to fight for working people. And I will say, we did not time Terry's pro people lawyering series to coincide with the inauguration, but I think that the timing is really quite special here. As we look at what's coming next over the next 4 years, we know that it is going to be critical that progressives think creatively about how to defend and even advance the rights of working people as our federal government falls under the control of anti-worker billionaires like Donald Trump and Elon Musk. And truly, there's nobody better that we should be looking to for guidance in this moment and on how we do that than Terri. So I'm going to let Terri introduce herself more thoroughly in a minute, but a quick rundown. Terri is currently serving as the director of the newly created NYU Wagner Labor Initiative. So excited to hear more about that, which is housed at the NYU Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. Previously, she directed the Project on State and Local Enforcement at the Harvard Law School Center for Labor and a Just Economy and was a senior fellow at the Economic Policy Institute. She is also a former Open Society Foundation's Leadership Fellow in Government Fellow, sorry. And prior to that, Terri was a longtime public servant in New York State government and worked for over 17 years enforcing labor laws, including as the Labor Bureau Chief for the New York State Attorney General's Office and as a Deputy Commissioner in the New York State Department of Labor. She has a whole breadth of experience, and it is really that we are trying to get into in this series, and as we are trying to kind of show the wide array of paths that folks can take within the legal profession. So as we get into this conversation, I really want to encourage folks to ask the questions that you want to hear answered. There's a Q&A box, there's a chat function. Drop your questions in. I'll be monitoring both of those, and we will do our best to get to as many audience questions as possible. With all of that said, and without further ado, Terri, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to join. And yes, the timing is, these are strange times, but they're times that call on all of us to really step up and do what we can. So I'm really glad to be here today.
Incredible. To start us off, can you tell us a bit about yourself, what inspired you to pursue a legal career in workers' rights, and how you got to your current position?
Sure. So, you know, when I when I went to law school, I knew I wanted to be a public interest lawyer, and I thought I would probably end up working in working for legal aid or working for some kind of, poverty law organization, or maybe being an international human rights lawyer. I did not really think that I would be someone who would be focusing on government specifically at all. And I wasn't necessarily oriented toward workers' rights. And I can share a little bit about like my perspective on all of this has really, and my motivations have really changed over the course of my career. With some embarrassment, I can say that early in my career, I think I had much more of that like do-gooder, like savior view of the work of just like I was going to be the lawyer who would like help people who are suffering, and then that would be really good, right? And I do respect that, and even though I'm talking about it like as I said with some embarrassment, but I do still think that like all of the work that I was doing was good, but I think my conception of it has really, really changed over time, to be much more thinking about systems and power and wanting to work on workers' rights issues, not because I feel like I can, like, well, yes, there is the fact that like people doing this work are helping suffering people, right? That is like very real and very, that is like a huge core part of it. But also the fact that like you're helping build power and helping, working within government has tremendous power. And I feel like people, the right and neoliberals for generations now have been like sort of demonizing the state and saying, we don't need government is the bad guy. And I think there's also a real trend among progressives and on the left to sort of be like, well, the real action is building power in community and in among workers, which I think is true. But I think also like we fall into a real mistake if we don't value like the power of government, and that government collectively has real power to change people's lives, to change markets, to change the way corporations act, to change the way people are treated, all kinds of things. And like that government power is part of why we're also, shell shocked by the change at the federal level, right? And so, I do think that, as I've evolved in my career, I think about it much more in terms of like trying to leverage the power of state and local government, which is real power, on behalf of working people, which again is much more of like a systemic understanding of like where my work fits in rather than kind of an individualized, like it's not so much like like from a movie, like if it's a movie, if my life is a movie, it's not so much that like I'm the like, it's not the hero saga, right? It's much more like the ensemble, I don't know, with like many, I mean, no, a tremendous ensemble, right? So I don't know how long I can like stretch that metaphor. But anyhow, so I got, you sort of went through my career a little bit fresh out of law school. I had a Skadden fellowship and I worked in Miami for a few years, first on a Skadden, then an Echoing Green fellowship representing immigrant workers. Miami was not where I was from and not where I was like kind of meant to be. And also like I was never going to end up like getting married and having kids if I lived there, just like wasn't going to happen. So I moved back to the Northeast, which is where I'm from. And I kind of hesitate to make that like comment, which is half joking, half not. I kind of hesitate to mention it in a professional forum, but I do think these things matter. Like having a family matters and like having a balanced life matters. And so then I moved up to New York and I clerked for a year and I started working. As I said, I wasn't planning on working for government especially, but I started working for the New York AG's office in the Labor Bureau, which was newly taking on affirmative enforcement work, bringing cases on behalf of workers, not just representing the state agency, but like doing its own enforcement. And that really shaped a lot of that experience, really shaped a lot of sort of what came after and a lot of how I understand the work now. At that time, George Pataki was the governor of New York, and the Labor Department was like not the state Labor Department was not very active. And George Bush was the president of the country, and his labor department was not very pro-worker. But we had an AG, Elliot Spitzer, who later became governor and then ended up resigning. But at that point, he was like a sort of very much like, aggressive fighting AG. And our office did tremendous work. And, there's a whole team of us, and we did tremendous work, worked very closely with unions, with worker organizations, community organizations, and really, really filled that void that existed because the federal and state departments of labor were like not really standing up for workers. So I did that, and then I ended up working in the state labor department, and then the state AG's office again. And when I left, I started the work that I'm currently doing now, which involves basically trying to help state and local governments across the country, you trying to enlist more players in protecting workers' rights and then trying to help them build their capacity and support them. So sort of somewhere on the line between being an expert, providing technical assistance and helping them, and being an advocate, sort of urging more to get involved and to do more.
So interesting. I didn't know you were a Green Fellow, in addition to being a Skadden Fellow. Very interesting. Cool. Okay, so to get everybody here oriented, Can you describe the different levels of government enforcement of workers' rights? And specifically, could you talk a bit about the powers that state and local governments have and how, if at all, those powers are impacted by the federal government?
Yes. So, in the US, we have a system that is not like a unified inspectorate where you have like one agency that's sort of one federal agency responsible for like managing everything at the workplace. At the federal level, there are multiple agencies. The most relevant ones are the US Department of Labor, which enforces the wage and hour laws, the workplace safety laws, and some other laws. There's the EEOC, which enforces anti-discrimination laws at work. And then there's also the National Labor Relations Board, which manages and enforces and implements all the laws related to workers organizing and to unions. But then at the state level, there are also state agencies. Again, the most primary one typically is the state labor department, which generally enforces minimum wage and overtime laws, in some cases, workplace safety and health laws. And then also it has other functions like administering the unemployment insurance program or administrating the workers' compensation program, which gives people lost wages and medical care if they're injured or killed on the job. Um, and then there might be a separate workers' comp. At the state level, it's set up differently. Sometimes the state labor department only does enforcement. Sometimes they also are in charge of unemployment and workers' comp. In some cases, they're also in charge of anti-discrimination. In some cases, they also run. It really varies what how they're organized. But generally, there's a state Department of Labor, and they may have different names. And then there's state AG offices. And state AGs, as most of the people here probably know, are the top legal officers in a given state, and they have a multitude of functions. They represent the state when the state is sued. They bring all of these, sort of public advocacy lawsuits, protecting consumers, antitrust lawsuits, civil rights, the environment. Until recently, workers' rights was not a significant chunk of what state AGs did, just for sort of historical, like bureaucratic reasons. But that's been really changing in recent years, and AGs have been getting involved. And then at the state level, there's also, like I said, there's workers' comp agency. There might be a standalone, like a standalone human rights agency that enforces the anti-discrimination laws. And then local governments are totally new in this space. Historically, cities and counties have not really done anything involved in workers' rights. Like, they do so many important things, but just like passing wage laws or paid sick leave laws or things like that has just like not been, it's not what cities did ever until about 10 years ago. And now I think in large part because advocates have seen that, there's so much stagnation at the federal level, even in the best of times, that you just like can't pass things, almost anything in Congress, right? And so, and then some states are very progressive, others less so. But again, I think advocates have really seen that one way to improve a lot of workers' lives and to move policy has been at the city level. And so we saw all these paid sick leave laws getting passed at the city level first, and you had them bubbling up in all these different places. And then sort of states started passing their own paid sick leave laws. And so that's sort of, that's kind of like the dynamic of how, Justice Brandeis talked about the states being laboratories of experimentation, and cities are increasingly playing that role also in relation to workers' rights. But that's kind of the dynamic where you have something kind of being piloted in a bunch of different places, and then it can like you have proof of concept, and it can spread and eventually, ideally, bubble up to the federal level, or at least the state levels. So those are kind of the players that are involved. The one other, and so a lot of local governments, I should add, have created, there's at least a couple dozen in major cities that have created local offices of labor standards that are enforcing paid sick leave laws or fair work week laws or higher minimum wage or fair chance hiring. And a lot of these offices are like pretty innovative because it's not like, we've been doing this since 1940 and we've always done it this way. Like they've all been created in the past 5 years. So they're like inherently, even though they're within government, they're inherently kind of entrepreneurial, and they're also like very thinly staffed generally. So like it's people who are just really used to just being creative and trying things. The one other player in this that I would mention at the state and local level is prosecutors. And there are DAs, especially those who are sort of really associated with criminal justice reform or the progressive prosecutor movement, who have sort of been thinking not just how do we refrain from, bringing cases that are really harmful or exercising our power in ways that are harmful to communities, but like what is it that we can do that will actually be prosecution that is in the, sort of social justice oriented prosecutions. And so some DAs, including Jose Garza in Austin, Texas, or Alvin Bragg in Manhattan, or Larry Krasner, who's a Philadelphia DA, have created worker protection units and have taken this on as part of their work, as well as some DAs who are, a little bit more, a little bit less associated with the progressive prosecutor movement, like the San Diego DA's office created a worker protection unit. And the DA used to be a Republican, is now independent, but is not really associated with like the, criminal justice reformers. So that's sort of like the universal players.
Super interesting. Cool. All the lights are going off of like what I'm hearing is there are a lot of interesting places to work if you are a young attorney who wants to make sure workers' rights are enforced. And that right now, the federal DOL, for example, might not be the first place you want to turn. So, on that note, you've obviously been thinking about state and local enforcement since well before even the first Trump administration. What promise have you seen in this path? And sort of as all of these exciting new avenues for workers' rights enforcement have been opening up, what is going well and why is this so important to continue to pursue?
So I think so some of the things that I think have happened are just that some of the most impactful advances on workers' rights have happened at the state and local level, from raising the minimum wage. I mean, the federal minimum wage is still 7.25 an hour, right? But we have, I don't know how many states that now have 15 or localities, but we've had massive, massive increase in people's wages because of action at the state and local level. And then obviously there's like passage of the policy, and then there's also the important work of implementing and enforcing it as well. Um, and then again, paid sick leave is another example, paid family and medical leave. These are things that we do not have. We do not have at a national level. Like if you live in Florida and you're pregnant and you're having a baby, you do not have the right to any paid leave, not a day unless your employer, if you have a union and your union contract requires it, or if your employer, because they're a high road employer and they choose out of the goodness of their heart, or because it's a good, competitive move to attract candidates, or because they, want to be a good employer, unless your employer just chooses to give you paid leave, if you have like there is no, it's like it is really shocking when you think about it that there's no paid sick leave, that like a significant number, I don't have the statistics fresh at hand, but a significant number of people don't have the right to a single paid sick day, and it's like a higher number of, very low wage workers, restaurant workers, and the same thing with paid family and medical leave. So I think that, these state and local policies and the implementation and enforcement of them really makes a big difference in people's lives. And then there's also sort of like bigger issues of in relation to like misclassification of workers, for example. People who are designated as employees are protected by all of our labor and workplace laws. And if you're treated as an independent contractor, which means you're supposed to be running your own business, people don't get any protection of the laws, not overtime, safety and health, workers' comp, unemployment, nothing, right to organize, none of it. And, this has been a huge issue in the gig economy, and there really hasn't been that much. I mean, there hasn't been that much government action altogether on this issue, anywhere, but to the extent that there has been successful progress, it's really been at the state and local level. Like New York City and Seattle passed laws setting a minimum wage for Uber and Lyft drivers, and for like DoorDash and Uber Eats and other delivery workers. There are some AGs that have filed lawsuits against Uber and Lyft, including Massachusetts and California, for misclassifying workers. The Minnesota and DC AG's office sued Shipt, which is Target's like delivery company. And just last week, the San Francisco city attorney has finished got their third settlement. There are gig companies now that are going into other industries, not just like Uber and Lyft, but that are like placing people, as dishwashers or warehouse workers and taking the position that they are independent contractors, which is just like so ludicrous. And the San Francisco city attorney, just like he created a worker protection unit in the city attorney's office, and the unit has, I don't know, like 3, 4, 5, let's say 3 or 4 people in it, 3 or 4 lawyers. And they brought a case against first one, then like they just resolved their third case involving a gig company that was misclassifying workers. And the resolution required the company to not only pay money that people were owed for overtime, but to reclassify their workers as employees to the entire state of California. Denver Labor in Denver is doing some similar cases involving, I think, Gig Pro and InstaWork. So like, through passing policies, through enforcement, through implementation, like they're able to take action on issues in ways that I think the federal government sometimes is a little slower to act.
Super interesting. I totally missed that out of San Francisco last week.
Oh,
That's
it's amazing. It's so cool. It's so great. And one of the things that I am trying to do, and all of these offices have very limited bandwidth, their resources are so slender. I mean, I feel like when I talk to people in federal government versus state and local, federal government, there's never enough resources, but there's like something. State and local government, it's like, here are 2 paper clips. Now figure out how to like build a whole program with this. There's a woman in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh has had a paid sick leave law for like 5 years, and it had never been enforced. And the mayor created an office, I think it was an office of equal opportunity or something like that, or equity. And they hired a person to enforce the paid sick leave law for the entire city of Pittsburgh. So, like, how do you do that as one person for the entire city of Pittsburgh, right? And there's no system in place. There's no spreadsheet, there's nothing, right? And this one person has managed, has been very strategic about how she's been doing it. And they did a ton of outreach to restaurants. They decided to focus on restaurants because it's an industry with a high, low wage workers, high rate of violation, and sort of a public health vector, right? And so they first did a ton of outreach to the restaurants within Pittsburgh, telling them about the law, trying to train sort of compliance assistants. And then at the beginning of last year, they put out a press release and did a big press splash. And the press release said, City of Pittsburgh to strictly enforce paid sick leave law. And I saw like, there were like 10, 11, it's not an enormous media market. There was all this media coverage, and they all picked up on that language, strictly enforce paid sick leave law, right? And so what kind of deterrent impact does that have if you're a restaurant and you see that they're going to strictly enforce the paid sick leave law? And then what they did is they invited restaurants to send their paid sick leave policies to the office to review and make sure they were compliant. And many, many did. Like, I don't remember if it was 100 or hundreds, but it was like a not insignificant number did. And a chunk of them were compliant and a chunk were not. And so then they worked with the restaurants to improve the compliance. And so I feel like that is it. Like, is compliance with the paid sick leave law in Pittsburgh perfect right now? Like, it's very hard to do that as a person for an entire city, for an entire new law. But like, if I just wish someone had been studying it, right? Like some academic, because I am certain that compliance with the law is markedly improved because of these efforts of just one person thoughtfully and strategically intervening.
is wild. For those who are looking for this information, which I just Googled, population of Pittsburgh is 303,000 as of 2023. So one person for a city of 300,000 is kind of unbelievable and also incredible to have that kind of impact. That's really, really cool. So if
I can share. I'll look for it while you ask the question. But I was just going to say I can share. I have a screenshot with some of the media from that that enforcement. And it's just like extraordinary, just like how much a person can really do if they're given the bandwidth and like they have an amenable chain of command that is not like scared of acting and that really wants to do things, right? Do you know the book, Molly, The Chicken Shit Club? Have you read that or heard of it? It's a really great book. It's by a ProPublica reporter, Jesse Eisinger, and he writes about how during the Obama administration, he critiques the Justice Department for like not forcefully enough like prosecuting and criminally prosecuting people during the more responsible for the mortgage crisis. And I think about, I mean, I think the title is just phenomenal, right? And I think about that a lot. And I think people in government and people in advocacy can sometimes be like very cautious and careful. And lawyers, especially, can be like, well, I need to think through the entire chess game. And, if there's a potential roadblock at, W, I don't know if I should do A through V, right? And I think that right now is a moment, like, look at all those executive orders yesterday, right? I don't think that's something to emulate. And I don't think anyone should be a bull in a china shop. And I do think we should like be careful and thoughtful and intentional. But I do think it's a moment for people both in and out of government to be really bold and standing up for people and not to be, you know, too like nervous. And so, what happened in Pittsburgh, I think is a great example too of like, I don't know all the ins and outs, but I suspect the mayor was very supportive of all of it.
Yeah, and something we've been talking about a lot recently is how we need lawyers who can get to yes on our side. And that often
Right.
lawyers see their job in the room is to be like, well, here are the potential pitfalls, here are the potential challenges we could run into. And it's like, great. How do we get to yes? How do we
Mm-hmm.
and how do we do
Totally.
what people need?
Totally.
So, if people have been making a list of all of the cities and states that you have mentioned, they would have, I think, a pretty decent list by this point, 30 minutes in, of places where they might look for postgraduate or next step employment. But I often, especially post-election, talk to law students who are maybe open to the idea of state and local work, but don't necessarily know where they might look to do really meaningful workers' rights enforcement. Again, you've mentioned a whole host of places already, but I'm curious if there are other states or municipalities that you see as doing an especially good job of using their enforcement power to protect workers.
So I think one thing I would say is I think just in general, and when I talk to law students or people early in their career, I always emphasize this. Um, as you think about what jobs you would take, it's important not just to think about what the office is doing or, what the job sounds like, but just like, are there sane, nice, non-dysfunctional relations? Like, is it a nice, healthy place to be working where you'll get mentored and people will pay attention to you? And so that might be like a different list or like an overlap, you have your Venn diagram overlap, right? Of like, the places where they're doing phenomenal work and the places where there are like lovely people. I will say for them, like, I just say that as like a general precaution in relation to government work or any work in general, because there's like transitions and changes and new administrations coming in. And so, there is always like some level of fluidity. With that said, I would say, first of all, that like all the offices that I work with a lot of AG offices that are involved in workers' rights, DA offices, I'm with local labor agencies, and I'm in touch with a lot of the state labor offices. And like the people are so nice. They're like really good people and they're really smart and they're trying to like use the powers they have to make a difference in people's lives. So with regard to state AGs, um, it used to be for all the years I was in the New York AG's office, there were just three AG's offices that did anything about workers' rights. It was New York, Massachusetts, and then California had a small underground economy unit. And that has changed a lot. Some of the offices those three are still involved in workers' rights. Some of the other offices that have created dedicated units and are really active include Washington, D.C. They have punched way above their weight. They've done like phenomenal work. Minnesota. I mean, you smile because I know you're from Minnesota, but like everything in Minnesota is great. The Labor Department is great. The AG's office is great. There's a couple of DAs who are interested in workers' rights. There's several local agencies, Duluth, Bloomington, as well as Minneapolis and St. Paul have local labor standards offices. So there's like a lot going on in the Twin Cities and in Minnesota. Um, The Illinois is another place where there's sort of a hub of this. The Illinois AG's office has been very involved in workers' rights. New Jersey has as well. Even some places like Rhode Island, which historically is a tiny AG's office and doesn't have a dedicated labor unit, but they've really taken on workers' rights prosecution, and the AG spearheaded legislation to um, make wage theft a felony. The something exciting that is happening is that the Washington and Oregon AG's offices both have new state AGs, newly elected AGs, who on the campaign, one of their campaign pledges that they talked about was creating a dedicated unit within the state AG's office. So I think that both the Oregon and Washington AG's office will be creating new units. Colorado and Arizona recently started new workers' rights units. Pennsylvania had a fair labor section. The AG's office recently changed hands. You know, it was Governor Josh Shapiro, and then it was someone else in the interim, and then it changed hands in terms of political parties. But my understanding is that the work is continuing in the Pennsylvania AG's office and is really going to be focused on criminally prosecuting employers who misclassify workers. So I think that's one of the really valuable things about this work being institutionalized in offices, is that it does become embedded, and it can be something that just, sort of becomes part of the work of the office. Um, I feel like I must be leaving some out, and I don't want anybody to get upset with me if any of them listen to this, but like those are some of the ones that jump spring immediately to my mind. And then in terms of DA offices, the Manhattan DA's office is terrific. Alvin Bragg is amazing. He was my boss at the New York AG's office and is like the kindest, most wonderful person and just smart in every way. And his worker protection team is terrific. The other two I mentioned, Philadelphia and Austin, Texas, as well as there's a lot of DAs in California who are doing this work. The state just created a new grant program to fund DA's offices to do this work. And then local labor offices, as I said, the Twin Cities and New York City has the New York City Comptroller's Office, and there's the New York City Department of Consumer and Worker Protection do really great enforcement. Boston has created a really good workers cabinet. Seattle, a lot of cities in California, but even places like Flagstaff, Arizona, and Columbus, Ohio, and Austin. There are like 3 or 4 cities in Ohio that have like wage theft units of various kinds. And they're more constrained because these are states where the state has preempted cities from passing their own laws. But the wage theft unit there is like looking to see, how can they make sure that bad actors don't get government contracts? So they're using the powers that they do have to try and make a difference. So it's really, really place specific, like there's a lot going on in Colorado, for example. There's like a few places where there's kind of hubs of activity: Seattle, Colorado, the Twin Cities, obviously New York, Boston, lots of places in California. But I think that there's opportunities in a lot of different places.
Really, really cool. I will not mention to anybody on this call what the current temperature in Minnesota is or how many school districts are closed due to the cold, but I can't wait to see you all move here very soon. Enforcement. Terri, you recently, by recently I mean like yesterday maybe, wrote an op-ed in Newsweek with Paul Son of the National Employment Law Project. I'm going to drop the link in the chat for folks. But you two talked about what states can do to, in your words, take advantage of the head start offered by policies developed by the Biden administration over the past 4 years. Can you talk a bit about some of what you hope to see states doing in the coming months and years to build off of the work of the previous presidential administration?
I mean, I hope to see them doing so much in so many ways, but you asked the question about building on the presidential administration, so I'll limit myself to that. So what we wrote like a number of organizations. There were, I think, 6 of us that put together a briefing about a few particular policies that we thought that states should just like act on, like Biden era policies. And it's a really smart thing for states to do because you already have the language drafted from the Biden era policy. And these policies, which were regulations that had either been proposed, like the OSHA heat standard to protect workers from extreme heat, or that have passed, like increasing overtime coverage and banning non-competes. There is an enormous regulatory record on this, analyzing the cost, the benefit, the impact on small businesses, massive amounts of economic and expert data and information, thousands of comments from the public. The non-compete rule, I remember seeing that they got something like 26,000 comments from the public, of which 25,000 were in favor of banning non-competes. So this, I think, should give states and these things were going to be the law, right? Like the regulated community in some cases, probably already started gearing up. Like, yes, there's the uncertainty about litigation and what happens in the end, but just like even proposing and finalizing a rule sends a powerful message to the regulated community, and the ones who want to like do the right thing are going to start gearing up to comply. So the fact that these things might not end up happening, either because the courts reject them or if the Trump administration rescinds them, um, these are things that like should have happened at the federal level. So our thought is that states, that pro-worker states that want to advance and support workers' rights, that these are like, I mean, I hate to say that this should be a way to like hit the ground running or to get a quick fix. Like we called it quick fixes. We called the briefing, and like nothing is ever as easy as it should be. But at the same time, these are all things that that were going to happen at the federal level and that some states have already passed. So one of the issues was increasing coverage of overtime. Overtime laws, people have to get paid a higher rate, time and a half after 40 hours. But there's an exception, the executive administrative professional exemption. That's basically the concept is if you're a professional or if you're an executive, that you kind of have enough bargaining power in the market that like you don't need overtime protection and you can be paid on a salary basis. But what happens is that corporations end up like calling people managers to use this exception and pay them a salary even though they have their and work them like 50, 60, 65-hour work weeks without paying a penny more. I wrote an op-ed once about and I might have mentioned this at some point in our op-ed, I'm not sure, but about a case I handled when I was really early in my career involving this little burrito chain, Burritoville, in New York City. They had like 6 or 7 locations, and in each location, like they had like 6 managers. They'd have like an opening manager, a closing manager, a delivery manager, a general manager, an assistant manager. And like the reason they did this was to avoid overtime. Um, and they did not, in the end, they had to pay a whole bunch of money and they ended up selling the business. But the law, the regulation has this salary threshold that basically is like, if you make less than this much money, no matter what highfalutin title they give you, you're not really a manager. Like you need the protection of overtime law. And so the Biden administration was going to raise that significantly. It's currently in the 35,000 range. They were going to raise it to like 58, 55, something like that. Meaning that if you're someone who's making like $38,000 a year or $40,000 a year, right now, an employer can pay you a salary, give you some like title and a little bit of responsibility and try to and like work you all these extra hours with paying nothing more. So that is an example of a policy. There are several states like New York and Washington and Colorado, and I think California that have already done this. They've already been like, yeah, in our states, you can't give people some elevated title as a way of avoiding overtime. We're going to choose a salary threshold that's like twice the minimum wage or 3 times the minimum wage. And if you don't get that much money, you get overtime, right? And so this is one example of it. And so, there's a similar story with the non-compete ban, a similar story with extreme heat. There are 6 states that have passed laws regulating temperature in the workplace. And 3 of them, Oregon, California, and Maryland passed laws basically regulating workplace heat, both for indoor and outdoor workers, not just outdoor. And so this is something the Biden administration proposed. There is no reason, I mean, especially states that have a Democratic trifecta, but states that don't, like states that just care about workers being safe and like public health, right? There's no reason that every state shouldn't pass these laws banning non-competes. Non-competes are like, there's a bipartisan proposal in the Senate to ban non-competes. Like this is not necessarily, and there are plenty of like red states that have banned non-competes. So we sort of laid out, these are, I mean, what we talked about in the brief were in the briefing were the overtime coverage issue, non-competes, workplace heat, supporting workers' right to organize, which that is one area where state and local government is really constrained because of National Labor Relations Act preemption. That really limits what state and local government can do. But there are still things that they can do. And one example that we gave is enacting unemployment insurance for striking workers, just like any other workers who are temporarily out of work. So that's one example. And then our two other issues, one was disseminating information and having sort of a public database of employer violations, which the federal government, the U.S. Department of Labor, has a really good usable public website where you can look up employer violations. But in a lot of states, it's not. There are some states that do that. California has information publicly available. Massachusetts does. The New York City Comptroller created an awesome employer violations dashboard that has, among other things, a wall of shame of particularly bad employers. But they did a ton of work getting together like all the violation history of employers within the 5 boroughs of New York City. Texas, the Texas Department version of the Department of Labor, they have it publicly available, wage liens over $2,000, where you can see employers that have wage liens in Texas. So there again, there is no reason that every state labor department, it's like you know it's one thing, certainly for completed cases where there's been a final determination that the employer has violated the law, like it's public work that's being done by taxpayer money. It's helpful for workers to be able to know. Like organizers have said that looking at that kind of information is very helpful for them because when a worker has been underpaid and they say, look, it's not you, this employer had 6 other wage claims against them, that is helpful for eliminating the shame that people feel about having been taken advantage of, but then also motivating them to take action, both to report violations and also to organize. It's helpful for the media because journalists don't have to file like 10 million freedom of information requests that then they get the answers to 6 months later. They can get information in real time. It's helpful for other government officers because then procurement officers can make sure that they're not actually giving contracts to like repeat wage thieves, right? So like that's another example of something that exists at the federal level, exists in some states, and like every state should be doing this. So that was kind of what we were focusing on, was just like, where are there, again, like calling it quick fixes. I hate to say that, but like these things and like creating a database, like that is not, that should not be a heavy lift politically. And like, I know nothing about IT. And so I don't know how hard a lift it is from a technological point, or monetary like resource point of view. But states do have that. They have that information. They have databases of their own. So like it's not even like you're creating information you don't already have. You're just making your information public. So yeah, so we were just trying to like find a few things that, every state should really do.
It's excellent. And I think both in terms of people thinking about the type of work that they want to be doing after graduation and where they might be able to get involved in pushing this forward. But I also think, all of these are opportunities for people, whether they're a current law student, regardless of their day job, to be pushing their elected officials to be doing this and to really be thinking about how do you organize to move, if you're not in one of the states that you've already mentioned, how do you move your state in that direction? If you are in a state or in a city that is already pretty good on this, where are there additional opportunities and where can you be thinking, about more change and better protection for workers? So it's really, really awesome to hear about. You mentioned a couple of possibilities for what we could see at the federal level over the coming years, both in terms of the Trump administration rescinding regulations advanced by the Biden administration, and also the ever lurking threat of the Supreme Court. So I'm going to combine two questions here and would just ask kind of what you're most concerned about looking at the early days of the Trump administration, kind of where workers are at risk, both from Trump, the executive branch, and also the judiciary. And then if there are ways that you're seeing state and local governments gear up to fight back against some of those risks.
So in terms of the risks, there's, I don't want my mind to like spin out of control into like scary places. But so one of the big impediments to workers' rights fulfillment in any way is the um the approach toward immigration and deportation. And just like we know that often the workers who are the most vulnerable, who have the highest rates of violations, are immigrant workers, often undocumented workers, but not exclusively. And in order for any government agency to be able to enforce workers' rights laws, workers need to be able to report violations to the government. I mean, this is just like very, very basic. It cannot be, there's the concern that just like if workers are terrified to go to the government, I think a lot of times ordinary people experience the government as like a big blob, and they're not like, oh, well, you're the city government, you're on my side, even though the federal government is not. Like, you're the ones who want to help me, right? And so people are very much afraid of coming forward, afraid of their employers calling immigration. And I'm just very concerned it's going to be complete open season for exploitative employers who want to absolutely, like predatory exploitative employers who just, really are bottom feeders who want to, take advantage of people. So that is one of the biggest concerns that I have. And in terms of what state and local government is doing to try to address that, there's certainly been, they're going to be filing all the state AGs from, certain states are going to be filing all the lawsuits they did the last time. But I think that there are state and local labor offices that have developed very, very close relationships with worker organizations, with community organizations, with immigrant groups, and that these kinds of these civil society organizations really act as a bridge and help make people understand that the government is not just one blob. I know that there are offices that are thinking about like, how do we enforce the laws if we don't have witnesses? Like, there sometimes are ways, right, of doing it, like based on paper violations, or if you can't have witnesses for your wage and hour case, maybe you can go after the employer for not having workers' comp insurance. And so at the very least, there's some kind of penalty for noncompliance, even if, workers aren't coming forward. But I think this is like, one of the prosecutors I worked with said it very succinctly, and I'm not going to be, he's like a New York person, and I'm not going to be able to like perfectly well reenact the way he said it, but he was like, it can't be that like, if you're undocumented, someone's allowed to just walk up to you and sock you in the stomach and nothing happens to them, right? But like, that's the system that's being set up. I mean, last time around, there were fewer reports of sexual assault, domestic violence, all kinds of things, because people were afraid to go to the government. So that's one thing that I'm concerned about. Another issue is just the Supreme Court, and that they're going to knock down all kinds of agency rules, the non-compete, the overtime rule, anything that is favoring, anything that involves protecting workers or curbing corporate excesses, or exercise of the regulatory state. And then we haven't talked at all about the FTC and the CFPB and the way that like antitrust and consumer enforcers have started thinking of worker issues as part of their mission as well. And so the FTC, for example, was very focused on different ways that there are consumer abuses or lack of labor market competition, like no poach agreements that harm workers, or looking at the impact of mergers, not just on consumer prices, but on workers. And so the FTC has been like amazing in this area. And the CFPB has been looking a lot at like debt, when employers put workers into debt, like through training repayment agreements that you have to pay money if you leave your job. And so that's another area that I think I'm concerned is going, will stop. And that I think, again, the states will have to pick up the baton and work on that. And then there's the challenges to the NLRB's structure, and is the Supreme Court going to, kind of dismantle the NLRB as we know it? So, and then there's just like rolling the red carpet out to corporations. And last time around, the Department of Labor, just in terms of violation, just plain old bread and butter wage theft, right? Last time around, the Department of Labor started like a kind of, they called it, I think it was called the paid program. And it was kind of like an amnesty program for violators, where if the employer like did a bunch of math and said, oops, we owe this much money, here we'll pay it back to workers, and the Department of Labor would be like, that's cool, and wouldn't investigate, further. And so there's just like, it's just kind of, when you think about all the things that a government agency or that the government broadly would do to protect workers, to make sure there's fair workplaces, that people are paid, that there's safety, all this stuff, it's just like going to be opposite day. And so that's the thing that, it's very worrisome, obviously. But we're talking about state and local government, and they do have, there is a lot of ability for state and local government to make a difference in not everything. And again, it's like geographically limited. So you see like an increase in the fissuring in some places between red and blue states, but even in red states, there are some areas, some glimmers where there's, advancement that can be good for people.
There's so much even from that last question that I'm definitely, so we might have to have you back for a part two of this.
Happy to do
I
it.
am, yeah, this has just been such a rich conversation. I would be remiss if I did not end on the question that we always end these sessions on, which is what advice would you have for law students or attorneys who are looking to enter this field?
Um, I would say people intending to enter this field, just talk to as many people as you can who are doing this work. I mean, for like the advice for law students and attorneys is different, right? Because law students, you have a little bit more space to explore things through internships, through summer jobs, and it's a little harder to shift once you're working. But I think for law students, just talk to lots of people who are doing this kind of work, get internships at these offices. If your law school pays for fun, I don't know how they're all like pretty, limited budget, but like if your law school has funds, do that. Find professors who are focusing on these issues. Although a lot of them are not necessarily going to have actual real world experience working with, working in these offices. But I think just like try to get internships working in these offices and build relationships with the people, with the lawyers in the offices. And like one thing I did not do when I like early in my career, and now it's like too late, is I never like knew to look for mentors. And so I think like finding people who will act as a mentor to you and who will take an interest and help introduce you to other people in the field, and just like, take classes on it. But more than anything, do like try and find a way to do, an externship, an internship, a summer job in some of these offices. And a lot of the people doing this work are very much in connection, interrelated with each other, with people in other parts of the country, and with other people in the labor ecosystem within a given geographic region. So, finding people who will kind of be your champion and like help connect you to people, I think is something that's very useful. And learning as much as you can about this work. I think also, like I said at the beginning, not focusing so much on like, I think that a lot of times people early in their career think like, well, what's the way, if I like sit in a room and think about it, like what is the way that I can have the biggest impact on this issue and the biggest impact on the world? And the thing is, you have to find something that is a good fit for you. Like I really loved working in government. I loved the ability to have an impact. I loved government is very, very collegial because no one gets credit for anything. The credit all goes to the elected person at the top. And no one has to fundraise, unlike in advocacy groups, no one has to fundraise. So there's like, it's all the incentives are toward collaboration and being like very collegial. And people are like, so many of the people I know work in government, the lawyers are like, they're so mission driven. It's such purposeful work. You have the ability to affect things. Like, I really, really loved it. but it does have some constraints. Like you can't just say everything you think on Blue Sky. I would have said Twitter 5 years ago, but like you can't have your blog. You can't, like it does have constraints. You're a representative of that office. You can't, there's ways that like you're acting through the work that you're doing and not so much through like expression of your personal voice. And there are people who are better suited to like run advocacy organizations and like have a megaphone in front of them and be out on the streets, right? And so some of it is not just figuring out how can I have the greatest impact, but like what is a good fit for my temperament and skills and the person that I am. And also, like I said before, like what's a good like non-dysfunctional office where I'm going to be in like a healthy environment. And so, in one place it might be working for a union, and in another place it might be working at at a local labor agency, and in another place it might be working at an advocacy group. And it also depends on where the openings are. For people who are currently lawyers, I think it's the same thing to the extent you can do pro bono work in this area. I would say to do that to the extent that whatever you're currently working in, there's ways to partner with government agencies or worker organizations. You should do that. I think that also like getting hands-on experience and like genuinely showing you're interested in it. Like I did a lot of hiring when I was the labor bureau chief in the New York AG's office, and we certainly saw people, for example, from private sector jobs, some of them who had done a ton of pro bono work, and it was very, very clear they were trying to pay off their loans and that they really wanted to be in the public interest enforcing workers' rights or some other kind of pro-social work. And then there were other people who said that that was what they wanted, but they had like absolutely zero on the resume that actually demonstrated it. And so I think just the more, like, if there's a kind of work you want to do, the more that you can talk to people and do work that is similar to it and build relationships, I think that's going to be helpful in getting in. Because it's not the kind of thing where there's like a whole, if you want to work in the Manhattan DA's office, like out of law school, like they hire a whole class of people every year. This isn't like that. It's much more like there'll be like one opening sporadically here or there. So yeah, that's some of my advice.
That's so helpful. And one of the things that we really, for those who have been to other Pro People Lawyering Series events or who are planning to come to these events in the future, one of the things that we're really trying to highlight is that there are so many ways to do good work through the law or with a legal degree, and that so much of it is finding what is the right fit for you and what is the environment that you want to be in, what balances your other priorities, like your need to post on Blue Sky or kind of other ways that you want to engage in the world, and how, regardless of kind of your personal preferences or other individual considerations, there are ways to use your degree to do good. So, on that note, Terri, just want to say a huge, huge thank you. This has been such a delightful conversation. I feel very privileged to have been able to be a part of it. For those who are tuning in, really want to say a huge thank you for spending your lunch hour if you're on the East Coast, your much earlier block of time if you are on the West Coast or somewhere in between with us. If you are new to People's Parity Project, if this is the first time that you have attended a PvP event, we want to get to know you. We hope you want to get involved. We are working to build a legal system that works for working people. We are organizing lawyers and law students into the project of building a more just society. We want to know you. We want to work with you. We want you to help get jobs like the ones that Terri has been talking about today. So please don't be a stranger. We look forward to working with you all in the future. And again, Terri, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Bye all.